Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm delighted to see so many of you here for this wonderful occasion. Of course, it is very unfortunate that we're still on Zoom, but we could almost have been outside today. The rain is actually, it wasn't rain, it was mist most of the morning, but now it's cleared. And but here we are on Zoom, excited to congratulate and to congratulate Professor Lawrence Prelli on this very well-deserved, outstanding award given by the College of Liberal Arts, the Lindberg Award, which recognizes excellence in teaching and scholarship and the integration of both of those wonderful pillars of our career expectations. So I want to formally welcome Professor Prelli, distinguished guests of Professor Prelli, and our colleagues, all of whom are present here this afternoon. Let me say, I think Professor Prelli is well known to most people, not just in the college, but across UNH. But let me say a few words of introduction before he gives us his distinguished lecture. And then at the end, we'll have time, not at the end, but in about 30, he'll talk for about 30 minutes or so. And then we'll have time for Q&A using the raised hand feature. So during the actual talk, the Q&A will be switched off. So you have to conserve your curiosity until he has finished speaking, and then I'll moderate the Q&A. So again, welcome. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here and to acknowledge and celebrate Professor Prelli. Professor Prelli was appointed to the tenure track faculty at UNH in 1985. His research, as many of you know, but not everybody here knows this, his research focuses on rhetoric in discourses on ecology and the environment and science and expertise, as well as on symbolic actions. He is renowned for his pioneering work in the rhetorical analysis of scientific discourse, and his 1989 book, A Rhetoric of Science, Inventing Scientific Discourse, which was published by University of South Carolina Press, was highly impactful in setting the scholarly agenda for many of his peers. The book received a Distinguished Scholarship Award from the Eastern Communication Association, and its reputation endures still as a core text in the field today. Professor Prelli's subsequent attentiveness specifically to environmental rhetoric and controversy made him a leading contributor to the growing subfield of rhetorical studies of science, technology, and ecology. In another strand of research, Professor Prelli is one of the earliest scholars to promote the examination of visual rhetoric. His edited collection, Rhetorics of Display, also published by University of South Carolina Press in 2006, earned a Best Monograph Award from the National Communication Association. Professor Prelli has also made significant contributions to the comprehension and critical application of the theorizing of Richard Weaver and Kenneth Burke. In addition to his books, Professor Prelli has authored many book chapters, articles, and papers, and edited special editions in leading disciplinary journals over the past 35 years. Data from his current book project, tentatively titled 3 Civil War Memorials, forms the basis for his lecture today. Professor Prelli's teaching is similarly impactful at all levels of the communication curriculum. His courses are rigorous, his pedagogy innovative, his classroom engaging, and his demeanor caring. Though communication does not have a graduate program, Professor Prelli has served on many PhD and master's committees, specifically in English and in natural resources. Indeed, indicative both of Professor Prelli's intellectual curiosity and his interdisciplinary acumen, he himself earned a master's degree in natural resources here at UNH in 1998 while an associate professor, so that he could further advance his teaching and scholarly goals. The exceptional quality of Professor Prelli's teaching has been recognized with a UNH Teaching Excellence Award in 2010, and in 2004, a Teaching Excellence Award from the Eastern Communication Association. So we are honored to call Professor Lawrence Prelli one of our colleagues, and we are honored today to celebrate with him the Lindberg Award. We look forward, Larry, to your talk, and we will have questions awaiting you at its end. So now I turn over to you, and I'll mute myself.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Michelle, for that introduction. Public commentary today is replete.
Share your screen.
I gotta share my screen. Damn Okay. Public commentary today is replete with concern about the fractured state of American political society. The Civil War and its sources are often evoked as an instructive parallel case for understanding our present political fissures. Terry. Uh-oh. How'd that happen? Just do it there. Oh, okay, pardon me, a little snafu there. On those terms, that is the terms of the Civil War parallel case, the Capitol insurrection today is seen as kind of a latter-day shot upon Fort Sumter. President Biden calls for unity. Critics plead that what we see here is not America. Others said, no, this is America. The question of who we are as Americans looms before us. That is no mere academic question. Tens of millions of citizens who support former President Donald Trump imagine themselves as the real Americans. They see themselves as patriotic, freedom-loving, God-fearing, anti-elitist, and victimized. Tens of millions of citizens who voted for President Biden also imagine themselves as real Americans. They see themselves as enlightened, educated, culturally sophisticated, empathetic, and under attack. These two tribes deeply dislike, distrust, and fear each other. The Black Lives Matter movement enacted a confrontational rhetoric that brought into public view how deeply race and racism permeated these divisions and conflicts. Many of those protests occurred at the symbolically rich sites of Confederate memorials in towns and cities across the South. We can learn a great deal about how we see ourselves and our polities by examining public arts and how we react to them or use them. Public art, legal scholar Sanford Levinson explained, is art chosen self-consciously by political institutions to symbolize the public order and to inculcate in its viewers appropriate attitudes toward that order. Such art is familiar. It adorns official public spaces, areas around Capitol buildings, national cemeteries, city halls, and the like. Here is the Spanish-American War USS Maine Memorial at a municipal building in Dover. Public art necessarily is political. It's built by people with sufficient power to marshal or impose public consent for their construction. And such art also is rhetorical. It projects what necessarily is a partial perspective, rooted in its time, evocative of questions for those who become audience to them. Questions about their identity, their place within political community, their relationship to the past, and the possibility for them of a hopeful present. How we imagine political community and our relations to it are now being constituted and contested across the commemorative landscape of the Civil War. The more we read about memory, historian Michael Kamen wrote, the more we are reminded of amnesia. They are coordinate concepts because they remain constant realities. Memorials often offer specific resolutions between what is remembered and what is forgotten. Scholar Kirk Savage told us that a public memorial or a monument calls upon those who visit them to share in collective acknowledgement of the memory deposited there. I will discuss how memories were deposited at 3 Civil War memorials: the Robert E. Lee Memorial on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial on the Common in Boston, Massachusetts, and the Ulysses S. Grant Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. I will then discuss counter memorials that reconstitute the memories deposited at sites like these, with a focus on events at Monument Avenue today. I will conclude with thoughts about the invention of memories that resonate with the multicultural, multiracial, democratic polity of the present. Let's consider the Lee Memorial. Here we see Jean-Antonin Mercy's Robert E. Lee Memorial. Unveiled on June 14, 1890, this was the first of several Confederate statues erected along the avenue. The statue embodies Lee as that predominant example of public virtue, the military hero. What do we make of Lee's appearance here? Lee is portrayed as though an officer on parade. There are no signs of battle about him. He sits erect in the saddle, appearing as though he and his horse are captured in synchronous movement. The hatless Lee is attired in an officer's uniform, equipped with ceremonial sword. Ulysses S. Grant described Lee as a man of much dignity, whose impassible face concealed his feelings. How did the orators characterize Lee at the unveiling ceremony? Former Confederate Lieutenant Colonel Archer Anderson stressed that the South had fared well in the war's aftermath. They had complete control over their governments. And he said, they were still not held to renounce any glorious memory, but free to heap honors upon our trusted leaders, living or dead. And heap honors he did. Anderson sought to articulate the virtues of the ideal commander, and he found them in Lee. Lee was a man of great moral courage. Lee fought for a righteous cause. Anderson said that George Washington's statue, standing in Richmond's Capitol Square, found its only fitting complement and companion in a monument to Robert Lee. Here we see a sketch of the ceremony from Harper's Weekly. The ceremony lasted 3 days. Former Governor and General Fitzhugh Lee led 20,000 former Confederate soldiers in a parade that ran from Washington Statue to the Lee Memorial and on to Hollywood Cemetery, the final resting place for Confederate war dead. The Richmond Times declared, "Richmond reoccupied by men who wore the gray. Our citizens welcomed them." Some northern newspapers complained about the event as insufficiently respectful toward the Union, but criticism never censured Lee. Local Black newspaper editors, however, criticized the celebratory focus on states' rights doctrine at the event, without any regard for the principle of political equality. This ceremony and others like it, as one historian put it, were clear reminders to the African American population of the racial power dynamic. So here the memory deposited was the story of the lost cause. Here is Augustus St. Gaudens's memorial of Union Colonel Robert Gould Shaw in the 54th Regiment, unveiled on Memorial Day, 1897. We see the white officer Shaw with 23 Black soldiers alongside him as they are marching to Boston Harbor to board a ship for South Carolina. This is an unusual composition. An equestrian statue was the standard for officers, but Shaw's abolitionist family urged the sculptor to somehow include the soldiers in the design. St. Gaudens hit upon the solution of putting the mounted Shaw alongside the marching soldiers in a bas-relief. William James was among the distinguished depositors of memory at the ceremony. He thought the integration of white officer and Black soldiers significant. See the mingling of elements within which the sculptor's genius has brought so vividly before the eye. There on foot go the dark outcasts, so true to nature that one can almost hear them breathing as they march. State, by its laws, had denied them to be human persons. There they march, warm-blooded champions of a better day for man. There on horseback among them, in his very habit as he lived, sits the blue-eyed child of fortune, upon whose happy youth every divinity had smiled. Onward they moved together, a single resolution kindled in their eyes and animating their otherwise so different frames. The bronze that makes their memory eternal betrays the very soul and secret of those awful years. James questions the selection of Shaw and the 54th as the subject of the memorial. How comes it that out of all the great engagements of the war, this officer, only a young colonel, this regiment of black men in its maiden battle, a battle moreover which was lost, should be picked out for such unusual commemoration? He answers that the war had but one meaning in the eyes of history, and nowhere was that meaning better symbolized and embodied than in the constitution of this first Northern Negro regiment. So what is that meaning? That is that at last there was removal of slavery, a thing of falsehood and self-contradiction, from the land of freedom, boastfully so called. For 3/4 of a century, slavery had endured, kept together by policy compromises and concession. But at last that republic was torn in two, and truth was to be possible under the flag. Truth, thank God, truth, even though for the moment it must be written in hellfire. That is why, James continues, after the great generals have had their monuments, and long after the abstract soldiers' monuments have been reared on every village green, we have chosen to take Robert Shaw and his regiment as the subjects of the first soldiers' monument to be raised to a particular set of comparatively undistinguished men. Shaw, in particular, represented the civic virtues required of ordinary young men in any living democracy, not the virtues associated with what James called the battle instinct, an instinct that needed little praise to gain applause. The very lack of external complication in the history of these soldiers, James said, is what makes them represent with such typical purity the profounder meaning of the Union cause. The location of the memorial across from the Massachusetts State House further signified that profounder meaning. Marching before the seat of power, Shaw and his regiment evoked the possibility of an inclusive biracial polity. The Shaw Memorial, then, exemplifies the story of emancipation. Henry Merlin Schrady's Ulysses S. Grant Memorial was dedicated on April 27, 1922, the centennial anniversary of Grant's birthday. At the center of the memorial stands the statue seen here. Grant's visage is unusual for a statue commemorating a war hero. He wears an ordinary army cloak and a tilted wide-rimmed hat. There is no officer's sword. There is no hint of formality. The difference from the aristocratic Lee is striking. Grant's bodily comportment suggests weariness. He sits slumped in the saddle. Note that his horse with perked ears is alert. Not so Grant, who appears distracted, as though lost in thought. Grant's statue is flanked by two statuary groups. On Grant's right is a cavalry group. Here we see the young officer, sword upraised, initiating a charge. A heroic gesture confounded by the fallen horse, its rider thrown, about to be trampled by his comrades' horses as they surge forward. On Grant's left is an artillery group. A horse rears, unsettling the entire group as the riders struggle to pull a cannon through a muddy quagmire. Soldiers sit huddled on the cannon, their fate out of their hands. Both groups show ordinary soldiers struggling on the edge of catastrophe. They are captured as though in movement through turbulent, chaotic, unpredictable circumstances. Grant and his soldiers are identified as ordinary men, even as Grant's greatness is heightened visually by his placement upon the tall base, topping off at 44 feet. The towering display of the reflective Grant raises the suffering and chaos of war exhibited around him onto the abstract plane of contemplation. No visual promptings about the cause involved are evident. Perhaps suffering for the nation is the virtue, regardless of cause. What memories did the orators deposit? Grant the Magnanimous, President Warren Harding called him at the site of his birthplace at Point Pleasant, Ohio. Orator after orator at the unveiling ceremony amplified that virtue by drawing upon the familiar story of Grant's treatment of Lee and his defeated army at Appomattox. They included Julian S. Carr, Commander-in-Chief of the United Confederate Veterans. He said, "General Grant proved a friend indeed when the Confederate soldier needed a friend." The tribute was complete, the Washington Post wrote of Carr's presence. If only Friend had come to praise the great Grant, it would have been only as it should have been. But with a former foe lifting his voice in the chant of praises, no more sincere tribute could be paid. Orators amplified Grant's magnanimity as worthy of what some called the magnificent Lee and his soldiers. Vice President Calvin Coolidge praised Grant's great adversaries and extolled the Confederates' peculiarly American qualities. They fought with a dash and a tenacity, with a gallantry and an enduring purpose which the world has known in Americans alone. At their head rode Robert E. Lee, marked with a purity of soul and a high sense of personal honor, which no true American would ever stoop to question. No force ever quelled their intrepid spirit. They gave their loyalty voluntarily, or they did not give it at all. According to the Post, as the ceremonial parade moved along Pennsylvania Avenue, spectators watched with marked reverence the column of Civil War heroes passed by, both the blue and the gray, with more recent heroes of the Spanish War and the World War. What they were witnessing, we are told, was less a parade than a pilgrimage. Initiated by Grant and Lee at Appomattox, reconciliation of North and South is consecrated in the nation's subsequent wars. We thus have the story of reconciliation through heroic suffering and sacrifice for the nation. I believe all of us can remember encountering these three stories in some form. They are manifested in a wide range of cultural forms like fiction, film, and historical accounts. One or another story might inspire, alienate, or fail to move altogether. But these stories still engage us today. But when we encounter these memorials, we bring our own experiences and perspectives. The movement of life causes monuments to be created, Kirk Savage wrote. But then it changes how they are seen and understood. That is the locus of how memorials operate rhetorically in the present. Not long ago, the Confederate memorials were quiet sites. Some people accepted that their presence was about preserving heritage and not racial hostility. Others may have thought of them as harmless anachronisms. Still others may have identified with the lost story enacted there. Events would shake such relatively tranquil attitudes. Neo-Confederate Dylann Roof's mass murder spree in an historic African-American church in Charlotte, the neo-Nazi Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Confederate memorials became sites of contestation. The Jefferson Davis statue on Monument Avenue, with its inscriptions of overt, prideful endorsement of the Confederate cause, now lay in ruins. Adherents of the lost cause story must have watched in horror at the desecration of what they once viewed as sacred ground. Unauthorized public destruction of Confederate memorials is quite a recent development. City officials would have entertained other strategies for altering the waning Confederate vision of political and social order. Add an interpretive plaque, relocate the memorial to a less central public place, build a memorial to victims or to adversaries of the Confederacy at the site, or some combination of these options. Some of these strategies were played out on Monument Avenue as the lost cause story increasingly lost its hold on Richmond's citizens. Monument Avenue had long projected the once dominant Confederate culture built on white supremacy. The Lee statue in particular was the site for ritual performance of white power, as we see here. There's no doubt of who is in charge when we look at images like that. For more than 40 years, gatherings at Lee's statue to commemorate the Confederacy was an annual event. The performance of white power was reiterated with each new addition to Monument Avenue. Jeb Stuart in 1907, Jefferson Davis that same year, Stonewall Jackson in 1919. A drive along the avenue brought into view Confederate heroes of the lost cause story in impressive, monumental form. On July 10th, 1996, that story was disrupted, excuse me, when Paul D. Pasquale's Arthur Ashe Jr. Memorial was unveiled. Virginia Governor Douglas Wilder, the first elected African-American governor in our nation's history, advocated that the memorial be located on Monument Avenue, where it would send a transcending message. The Ashe statue functioned as a counter-memorial, creating what critic and rhetorician Kenneth Burke called a perspective by incongruity. The presence of Richmond's Black native son evoked a story of greater resonance among Richmond citizens in 1996 than the military and political leaders of the lost cause. Ashe, the barrier-breaking athlete, civil rights activist, and AIDS education advocate, struck a much different model of civic virtue. His memorial prompts recognition that had those Confederate leaders won their cause, there never would have been an Arthur Ashe. Monument Avenue became quiet again with the end of the Ashe Memorial controversy. After the Unite the Right rally in nearby Charlottesville in August 2017, newly elected Richmond Mayor LeVar Marcus Stoney established a commission to decide what should be done with Monument Avenue. They advised him to remove the Davis Monument, replace it with a memorial dedicated to African-American soldiers who fought for the Union, and add contextualizing information at the other Confederate sites. After Floyd's death in May 2020, protests erupted on Monument Avenue. The mayor found himself confronting an angry crowd of protesters who, demanding removal of the Lee statue, had been repelled by city police using tear gas. Over the next 3 days, he apologized for the police action, marched with protesters from City Hall to the Lee Memorial, and made the decision that all of the Confederate statues had to come down. Here's the mayor with the protests during that march. According to one news account, the mayor recalled being overwhelmed by the enormity of the pedestal and figure rising from the Richmond dusk. I was suddenly blown away by the reason they were there, he said. It was to send a clear message. They were still in charge, no matter the outcome of the Civil War. That epiphany is something that I suspect many others had experienced, an epiphany that rendered the sanitized heritage and not hate version of the lost cause story unconvincing. Only the Lee and Ashe memorials still stand on the avenue, though Lee's is facing imminent removal. On December 1st, 2019, Kehinde Wiley's work, Rumors of War, was unveiled in front of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, blocks away from Monument Avenue. Wiley recounted that Monument Avenue had filled him with a sense of dread and fear. Yet he also found the heroic forms of equestrian sculpture impressive for the epic monumentality, the romanticism, the power of images of the human body in action. He transferred those qualities in a work displaying a very different subject. Notice how both the Jeb Stuart and Rumors of War statues share the same form. The high stepping horse, the battle posture of the riders, and even the general's plumed hat is matched by the young man's plume arising from his dreads. Both statues convey confidence, if not defiance. Mayor Stoney said of the statue, "Believe it or not, it's taken more than 100 years for the rest of Richmond residents to have a monument of a man on a horse who looks like them. And ladies and gentlemen, they deserve it." He continued, "This confident warrior with his dreads, his ripped jeans and his Nikes has literally given us something to look up to. It sends this profound message to all. We see you, we hear you, we love you." Dustin Klein, a light projection artist, changed the meaning of the Lee Memorial by a digital projection of words, still images, and video clips. The memorial itself is site of its own counter-memorial. Here we see the projected images of Floyd and a symbol of Black power. African-American leaders from the Civil War era to the present are projected. Here is Harriet Tubman. Here is a vision of a reconstituted polity. This display is not sanctioned by governmental authority. It is entirely vernacular counter-memorial with implications for reimagining the political and social order. The protesters have seized the once but long fading and no longer culturally dominant memorial and made it a living memorial of their own. People at the site watch the images, create shrines to victims of police brutality, inscribe slogans and symbols, talk with one another, barbecue, and listen to music. As one person put it, "I am thrilled that the Lee Monument still stands, for now it is appropriately clothed and adorned in the human imagery of those Lee fought to keep in chains. May it be forever so. Leave them there, for the images of Breonna Taylor, Harriet Tubman, George Floyd, and John Lewis speak with exponentially more powerful voices and force than any vacant ground left by the statue's removal." As Confederate statues were being removed from Lee Circle in New Orleans, Mayor Mitch Landrieu posed a question. We should stop for a moment and ask ourselves at this point in our history, if presented with the opportunity to build monuments that told our story, would these be the monuments we want the world to see? Is this really our story? And unlike what these Confederate monuments were first erected, and unlike when these Confederate monuments were first erected as symbols of white supremacy, we now have a chance to create not only new symbols, but to do it together as one people. In so many words, the mayor asked, what does it mean to be a citizen of New Orleans today? Public demonstrations, exhortations, and deliberations at memorial sites across the country are raising similar questions. What does it mean to be an American in a democracy today? Past portrayals of once admirable people and events are now repudiated in the present. Like Columbus here, so many figures once celebrated as virtuous are now reframed as vicious agents of white supremacy, colonialism, and genocide. The Confederate memorials are only part of that story, though a significant part. We are witnessing across these sites a struggle for regime change in America's memorial culture. What possibilities are available for reinventing memories for deposit at today's monuments and memorials? I want to approach this question from the vantage of the theory and practice of rhetorical invention and formulate some topoi, topics for generating thought about those possibilities. The four topoi are framed to guide thinking about how public memorials should function in a multicultural, democratic political order. Together, they foster a kind of ethical remembering, a concept I borrow from Professor Viet Thanh Nguyen's book, Nothing Ever Dies. First, there is the topic of the one and the many. Putting the ash statue on Monument Avenue illustrates use of that topic. The hegemonic one is countered with an alternative. This is a fairly standard strategy. Dilute the dominant display by emphasizing alternatives, the diverse many. Yet another possibility is to unify these opposites, a memorial landscape containing a diversity of perspectives. Together could symbolize a democratic conversation. Out of many voices, there is the democratic one. Other possibilities could be spun out with this topos as well. Second, there is the temporal topic of the past and the present. Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, like Wilder, did not support removal of the Confederate statues until the Black Lives Matter demonstrations following the Floyd killing. It's like scales falling from my eyes, Kaine said of the protests. The problem with the statues isn't what they say about the past. It's what they say about people and our values in the present, and the vision they suggest about a troubling future. Are we ever going to be equal? His epiphany, similar to Mayor Stoney's, warranted rejection and removal of memorials to the past that foreclosed the possibility of a hopeful present. Unifying the one and the many does not involve inclusion of Confederate causes on the avenue. Since emancipation, the emancipatory story, and the Confederate causes cannot both speak to a hopeful present in a multicultural democracy. Third, there is the humanity and inhumanity topos. When enacting public displays of the past, we disclose assumptions about who we imagine ourselves to be. That often entails confronting who we are with at least an implied other. Ethical remembering requires recognition of the humanity and the inhumanity in both us and them, however we conceive of us and of them. Memorial displays should not purchase unity in us at the price of scapegoating or demonizing some other. Such displays would frustrate ethical recognition of our shared humanness and difference, a recognition essential for citizens in multicultural democracy. And finally, there is the topic of acceptance and atonement. The privately owned Whitney Plantation Museum in Wallace, Louisiana, functions much like a memorial. It offers visitors an unsanitized version of that great evil based on depictions of the experience of slaves. Visitors are not offered symbolic redemption. They are confronted with the demand that they accept slavery's inhumanity as a spur to complicated reflections about its implications for them and the polity to which they belong. Imagine the placement of a similar memorial to victims of American slavery on the National Mall, a place symbolic of American national identity and character. Such a memorial, sanctioned by political institutions, would symbolize the nation's acceptance of so massive an evil as part of its past and its identity. That would be a very significant event. There is no question of atonement, at least not yet. Perhaps that part of the acceptance atonement topic is premature, a confusion of past with prelude. We cannot commemorate what has not yet happened. What may first be required as political action, what may first be required is political action proportionate to slavery's legacies. Voter suppression, mass incarceration, systemic racism, national acts of atonement. Those acts, should they ever occur, might themselves become worthy subjects of commemoration for a multicultural polity, thereby enabling citizens to better envision living in a more hopeful democratic present. Thank you. How strange it is to not hear applause.
Yes, well, thank you, Professor Prelli.
You really like that, huh?
Thank you very much, Professor Prelli. That was excellent. And you raised a lot of very interesting issues. And we have quite a few people on the call. So I want to open it up to questions. You know, please just put your hand up and I'll call on you unless there's a, you know, just go ahead. I don't see any hands right yet. Maybe while we're waiting on the hands, I will use this power that I have to ask Larry, one question I have is when you use the term counter memorials, I'm wondering, is that not a symbolic concession that somehow there's something less valued about what you're calling the counter memorials?
Well, the idea of counter memorials, I'm kind of theorizing this concept because it's often used in the concept that, as it is in Germany, the counter monument. People have criticized trying to erect monuments, the whole idea of a monument, to commemorate the murdered peoples during the Nazi era, because they think that monuments kind of are rigid and dogmatic, and in a way you're using a form that kind of is fascistic in and of itself, to celebrate the victims or commemorate the victims of fascism. I'm not using it in that sense. I'm using it in the sense of, I'm developing it in the sense of how Kenneth Burke talked about the counter statement. The counter statement is a statement that a critic would use or a political activist would use to challenge received power, received meaning. And by arguing its opposite, countering that statement, you create a kind of dialectic among ideas with the potential for generating a more encompassing point of view. Right? So that's the counter statement. I'm trying to reconceive or theorize about the counter memorial in analogous terms. The counter memorial is still a memorial. But in this case, we've looked at a series of counter memorials that counter the Confederate memorials and the stories that they symbolize. So that's what I'm trying to do with that concept. I still haven't sharpened it up completely.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. So can I see some hands up?
Professor Richmond has his.
Okay, yes, please, Professor Richmond, go ahead, unmute and go ahead.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Larry, for a glorious lecture in the full sense of that word. And I want to thank you particularly personally for describing so vividly the statues and displays you described. I'd like to ask you about dates. You mentioned that the Grant statue went up in 1922, his centenary, I think. Could you talk about the Robert Gould Shaw going up in 1897, and I think the Lee in Virginia went up in 1898? And do those have any particular significance?
Well, the Lee statue came, the dates, I mean, we can certainly situate them in their times. I'm not sure what you're asking, David. The significance of the time in which they were erected?
Yeah, I'm wondering about, because these statues went up long after the war, about the 90s and not the 60s or the 70s. And I'm thinking they went up in particular times and on particular occasions.
Yes, they were, and I think one of the striking, when we think about the erecting, say, of the Lee Memorial, this is in the when Reconstruction was over, and there's a sense in the commemorative rhetoric about the Lee monument that, the Confederacy did pretty well. They may have lost the war, but they retained they lost slavery, but they retained control over their governments and over their cause. So if we locate this in its immediate context, memorials, I think, say more about what's going on. We look at memorials, and memorials are almost put into place, in my view, to symbolize ideals and values that are really being discussed and amplified at the time. So in the case of the Lee Memorial, it's quite clear that I think the Lee and the other Confederate memorials are seen as a way of celebrating the restoration of Southern control over its institutions and the implications of that control for a white-dominated political and social society. I don't know if that answers your question, and we could do that.
It answers it fully. I think that's the point, is that all the arguments that we are hearing these days, that these are wonderful reflections of what happened in this glorious war, well, they're wonderful reflections of what happened 30 years after the glorious war.
Right.
Reconstruction ended, which is a different thing. So.
That's right. During Reconstruction, the issues would have been things would have been very much at issue.
Yeah.
I imagine that Grant, for example, the Grant statue, you can see this kind of, in the celebration of the nation coming together in the context of kind of imperial efforts, we're all now brothers. And I use that term specifically. We are now brothers, united in struggle and sacrifice for the nation, the kind of imperial nation. Now, Grant, I think, would have some serious problems with some of that, although he clearly was a nationalist. But you can see how the personage of Grant is used to amplify the values and concerns of the day. You don't find one orator at that ceremony talking about Grant the president. That would raise some difficult issues, right? Yeah. Grant the president who crushed the Ku Klux Klan. Yeah. Grant the president who saw the passage of the amendment giving African Americans the vote. Grant, very positively disposed as an advocate of African American political rights. But if you were to say something like that, I believe then, it would be perceived as grossly inappropriate to the occasion, that old rhetorical standard. Yeah. But at least the occasion in Washington, D.C. I find that conspicuous omission, really, really very stunning.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you.
Thanks, David, for that question.
Good to see you, David. It's been a long time.
Yeah, and congratulations.
Yeah.
We get a nice interdisciplinary audience here. So I believe our next person with a hand up is our distinguished provost, Wayne Jones. Wayne, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks, Dean Dillon and Professor Prelli. Larry, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. Most people don't know that though I'm a chemist by training, I was a history minor, and actually it was the Civil War that I did most of my coursework in. I was intrigued as I was listening to your talk, and I understand you were focusing on Monument Row in Virginia, but I'm intrigued, kind of building on Professor Richmond's question. They come in waves, and the first wave was the creation of these monuments, and I understand how that positions itself relative to 30 to 50 years after, kind of the end of the Civil War, the start of the First World War. Is there a similar wave of monuments outside of Virginia? And what does that wave look like for the counter memorial? So you referred to the Arthur Ashe statue in 1996. I would be shocked if that was the beginning of that wave. That wave probably started sooner. Can you talk a little bit about that wave of counter memorials throughout not only the US, but specifically the South?
Well, I think the Ashe Memorial, I wish I had some specific dates for some of these others. the Ash Memorial, we might count that as just kind of a ripple rather than a wave, but you know, there are other strategies throughout the South where monuments to the Confederacy were being altered by official power, by political power. There's the Liberty Place Memorial in New Orleans, which is a memorial that celebrates an insurrection where they killed Black Union soldiers. So the Union soldiers were the you know, the villains at that memorial. So you had a series of efforts there to inscribe new messages, and some of them were really vague, you know, rather than using statements that glorified Confederate insurgents who were trying to overturn the Reconstruction government. You had them saying something vague like lessons to be learned for us all, you know, some vague thing like that to try to blunt the original intention. So there were a lot of monuments that were engaged sort of piecemeal like that. But what we're seeing now, I don't think there's ever been such a wave, to my knowledge, of attacks and rejection of Confederate memorials than we see now. And it's become even wider and more encompassing. General Grant, you know, had you know, the statue to General Grant in San Francisco was toppled. That was toppled because he married into a slave. There are all kinds of justifications given. I don't know which one it is, but some of the justifications are, he married into a slave family. He oversaw the slave labor for a period, and he owned a slave which he freed when the slave was 37. That's one line of attack. So people are saying, well, the fact that he crushed the South and he became a champion of political freedoms for African Americans, you know, that's sort of challenged. And then you add to it the other dimension of this, where Grant was president during the Plains Indian Wars. So you have Native Americans challenging Grant's heroism and his suitability as a model of virtue that stands for what Americans admire. I didn't give you a good answer to that question. It's a good question. I'd like to go back and sort of add up these changes in the past and get a good grip on the historical period when they occurred. But one thing we shouldn't lose sight of, I think, is just how massive what we see going on now is.
Yeah, the context of today, I think, is very important. That was perfect. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, Larry. Professor Salyer had her hand up. Is Lucy still here? I don't. Professor Salyer, has she left? All right. Would anyone like to imagine what Professor Salyer might have wanted to ask and ask it? Either from Professor Lepler, can I pick on you?
Well, I can't imagine what Lucy was going to ask, although I would love to be able to enjoy Lucy's ability to think through things. But my question has to do with disciplinarity. And so memorialization of the Civil War is a big topic in US history. And I'm just wondering what makes the communications discipline different in its approach to understanding this question from the history discipline?
Well, I think they're interwoven. You know, that we can't, a lot of what we do in rhetorical studies today involves, you know, historical inquiry, and it's always been that way. But what we do bring to bear, I think, especially in a topic such as this, is when you study the intellectual history of rhetorical practice and theory. There are ideas that go back to antiquity that have developed over history, such as the idea of epideictic forms of rhetoric that define, as I've been putting it, explicitly, that defined, say in Athens, what it meant to be an Athenian, defined a polity. So you have Thucydides, version, rendition of Pericles' great funeral oration. That is an epideictic form. We can look at other similar epideictic speeches, but one thing that I've tried to show in my work in Rhetorics of Display is that certainly today, epideictic forms are not restricted to oratory, right? I would even suggest that film could be an epideictic form, where people can learn about what they should value and disavow by watching films. I would think that a lot of people in my generation, for example, probably learned more about the Vietnam War and how to think about it from the films that came out about it, and how they would praise and blame and construct heroes and villains. So I think what I try to do anyway, speaking for this one rhetorician, is I'm trying to broaden out the concept of epideictic, maybe not even with using that term, but to encompass all of these manifestations of what can conceptually be thought of as epideictic in a whole range of cultural forms. Now, it's really not going far afield to think, when you're thinking of celebrating what it means to be a member of a community, or what it means to be a community, to go from oratory to memorials, monuments. So it's viewing these as resources for forming a polity, and the strategies and resources available for doing that. That's where we center our attentions, I think. At least that's what I do.
Thanks, Larry. Jessica, do you want to follow up?
No, I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, good, thank you. Well, it does raise, I don't see any other hands up at the moment, do I, from any communication colleagues? Yes, Professor Kidwell. Marty, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Larry, for that very wonderful presentation. I have a communication related question, which is, you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe you could say more about, so how does this memorial form provide affordances and constraints on the way individuals in the public can participate with it, whether it's by walking by such a memorial as an individual, or taking a tour and having a tour guide point it out, or, so I think it constitutes a different sort of communication media than, like a journal article, or, a film, or trying to change policy through governmental channels. So maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think, again, a way to think about this is as epideictic. Epideictic speeches doesn't tell you to do anything. It's really a matter of establishing what you value, or as it usually said, what is virtuous and vicious. And when it comes to, there are a lot of sites, memory sites in particular, that kind of serve this epideictic function of revealing that which is meaningful and good, and concealing that which is bad about who we take ourselves to be. So I've been focusing here on kind of official monuments and how they're used and explained, say by the Park Service, right? If you go to Boston and walk along with the rangers, one of the rangers there, they're going to tell you a standard story. It'll be a variation on a theme that really tries in one way or another to bring alive the narrative that America is forged through suffering and sacrifice in order to redeem its values. That seems to be a stock line of talk. It could be varied in many different ways. So there's an epideictic expression right there. Where they're framing the meanings of these places. Now, I think that when it comes to the form itself, the memorial form, you're right. It's like any other form. There are limitations on what you can do with it. And one of the interesting things that we see on Monument Avenue is that Lee Memorial. How that has been transformed into a site where people celebrate themselves, right? It's almost like they're dancing on the memory, the rejected memory of Robert E. Lee. And so it's a very interactive form. You have people, it's actually quite moving. You don't hear much of this in the news media, but bringing elderly African Americans to the site and having them sit there and be able to contemplate based on their experiences, the changes that seem to be afoot, and how inspiring that can be for them. Now, you're not going to be able to get that at any memorial, right? And in fact, I think you'd have a hard time having it be so effective if there wasn't this kind of living presence of people really engaging with what the place means, an active memorial. And often that sort of thing, if we look at all memorials, that the enthusiasm, the most enthusiasm we have for any memorial is at its unveiling. And probably from that point on, it will start to fade. Even the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, where that was a very controversial memorial. People interacted with it. You could go there and it didn't really matter how you viewed the Vietnam War. You could experience, you can go there and remember the war itself without being told what to think about it. And then people would participate as well that that create little shrines or they leave objects and this kind of thing. I guess the Park Service had a warehouse full of this stuff, where people would go leave symbolic tokens and interact with the memorial. I suspect, though, that as my generation passes out of existence, the Vietnam generation, that will probably be a lot less. It will fade more into memory.
Well, thank you, Larry. On that note, I have to bring this to a close. Unfortunately, it was just a couple of minutes after 2. It's a fascinating topic and obviously a lot of interest and a lot of things we could talk about and pursue. So let me again thank you all, the audience, for coming and celebrating this Lindberg Award to our great colleague, Professor Prelli. And thank you, Professor Prelli, for your wonderful talk today and addressing our questions. So congratulations again, and I hope everybody has a nice afternoon.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all of you.
Clap, yes.
Thank you.